In this video, we're going to see how we can enter and exit different levels or scenes within Unity while keeping track of our positions on each entrance or exit out of a scene. So for instance, let's say we had a warp pipe a la Mario, and we jump up on it and we go down into it. Well, as you can see, I appear on the first warp pipe, and depending on which warp pipe I take, the second or third warp pipe, is going to correspond to the warp pipe in the first grassy scene I was in. Accordingly, if I go to the third warp pipe, I'm now in the third warp pipe of this cave type level. First warp pipe. Now we're back on the other side of our glass wall on our grassy scene. Alright, so let's just get into this code real quickly. Okay, so I have a new scene, a new project in which all of the work I just showed you no longer exists, so I can walk us through it step by step. All right, the first thing we're going to have to do is set up a warp pipe game object. This warp pipe will not only serve as a visual reference for where we want to enter and exit our scenes, but it's also going to have a trigger collider on it with some code that calls our load level functions that we're going to be making here in a second. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to go ahead and I guess I'll just go ahead and make a simple cylinder. I'm just going to create it from scratch. You might have whatever game object, whatever collider you want to use, whatever trigger. I'm just going to make my own from scratch. All right. So I'm basically just going to reset its values here, and I'm going to make it a little bit thicker, and I'm going to raise it by a whole unit so it sits right on top of the ground here. And I'm just going to put a simple green material on it that I already have made up. So here I have just a simple cylinder, and I've positioned it the way I want it. Why don't I go ahead and zero out the z-axis? What I'm going to do right now is I'm basically going to make a prefab. So I'm going to get this wall out of the way. So I'm going to select my wall group object and just deactivate it so I can just focus on my warp pipe. I'm going to call this warp pipe mesh. That sounds pretty good. All right. Notice it already has a capsule collider on it. That may not be the best for our situation because we want to stand on top of our cylinder. So just for this example, I'm going to put a mesh collider on it just so I can stand on it flushly and don't have to worry about the weird collision of the rounded capsule. All right, we're going to do one more thing here. We're going to create an empty game object. And for all intents and purposes, this is going to be our warp pipe in general. And I'm going to reset these values real quick in my inspector with that gear. And I'm going to parent my warp pipe mesh underneath my empty game object of warp pipe. Well, actually, you know what? Before I do that, I need to do something first. I need to position this game object just so. This empty game object I've called warp pipe is going to have a physics box collider on it. And I'm going to position it right above my warp pipe. This is going to serve two purposes. This is going to tell Unity the position in which to spawn my first-person character controller. And it's also going to serve as my collider trigger. So with this new box collider component I've put on here, I'm going to check is trigger, and I'm going to tweak its size. And it's a little bit easier if you press this little joint tool right here. You can actually select faces on our collider here, and you can just make them as big or as small as you want it without having to mess with numeric values. So in this little box, when a player enters this box, they'll be able to load into another scene. All right, so I got my warp pipe collider set up, and I've got it positioned just right. All right, and I think that'll be high enough. There might be a little bit of question here because I need to have my standard asset first-person controller in here so I can see if that position right there is going to be enough clearance for my first-person controller. So I'm going to go to my standard assets. You can load those in by right-clicking on Assets, Import Package, and Characters. So in my standard assets, I have a Characters first-person controller, and we're just using the simple FPS controller here. All right. So as you can see, it loads a capsule collider type controller in here. And what I'm going to do is I'm just going to position, and I can go into 2D view so I can see exactly what's going on here. And that looks about like a good position right there. So right now I'm just using this as reference for where to position my warp pipe collider. And I'm going to get it as close as center point as I can. It doesn't have to be exact, like so. Those two arrows are looking pretty good. All right, so I'm going to come out of 2D view. And why don't I go ahead and shore up this bottom part right here. All right, great. Maybe make it a little bit taller, just in case. All right, so my first-person controller has been used as a reference to position my warp pipe trigger. So I'm going to move this guy out of here. I'm going to position him at 0.9 in the Y direction and maybe negative 15. I'm just going to let my first-person controller chill right here for a second. We're going to be using him to control our scene. And since I have my first-person controller here, I can go ahead and delete my camera. All right, great. So I have my warp pipe trigger in the correct position with a is trigger collider at the right size and the right position as well. So now I can take my warp pipe mesh and parent it underneath my warp pipe. So now when I select warp pipe, my mesh follows my trigger area and all is gravy. All right, so 3. Right now I'm just going to make sure that my values are zeroed out. I'm working in the center of the screen now because I'm going to make this warp pipe a prefab. So I'm going to go to my prefabs folder I have made. Let me delete these old ones I was working with. And I'm going to drag and drop my warp pipe in this empty prefab folder. And now I have a prefab. This will come in handy later when we're tweaking values and we need to make a bunch of changes across all of our different warp pipes in our scene. All right, so I got my warp pipe made with the correct trigger. What's next? Well, I think we need to create a scene manager. Our scene manager is going to be an empty game object that follows us throughout whatever scene we load, and it's always going to exist, and it's always going to carry pertinent information that we need to pass between our different scenes. So I'm going to create an empty game object real quickly. I want to call this scene manager. Now, if you have a game manager, you can try to combine the code. If you have a game manager already made, you can try to combine the code for the scene manager I'm doing, but it won't hurt to have a separate scene manager and game manager. It's all about how you want to organize your project. So with that scene manager game object made, I'm just going to zero it out. It's just going to exist within my scene. It's just going to do its own thing. No meshes are going to be attached to it. The only thing we're going to do to it is attach a new script. So in my scripts folder, I'm going to right click in this empty space, create a new C# script. I thought I did that right. C# script, thank you. I'm going to call this scene manager. There we go. Give Unity a chance to deal with it. And I'm going to drag and drop it onto my scene manager game object. And now you can see I have a scene manager script in my inspector in the top right of my screen right here. So why don't we just go ahead and open up our scene manager. All right. So the first thing I'm going to do with my scene manager is make it follow the singleton pattern, because we need to have a game object that just can reference itself so we can call different functions globally within our own scene or within our game project. So the first thing I'm going to do is type public static, and I'm going to call my class that I'm working in. I'm then giving my variable a type of scene manager, and I'm going to call this variable instance, and I'm going to equal it to null, and press Control S. All right. Why don't we change this void start into void awake? And we're going to type the following code. This is what's going to set up our singleton, as well as keep this game object permanent between different scene changes. So we're going to say if instance equals null, then what are we going to do? So our instance is a variable that points back at the script we're working in right now. We're going to say if instance equals null, then we're going to say don't destroy on load. And what do we not want to destroy on load? This game object. This is going to make sure our scene manager is going to stay permanent between different scene loads. And we're going to say instance equals this. So basically, when we load a new scene or go into a new scene, we're not going to destroy the previous scene manager, and we're going to set our variable to point back at our class we're working in right now. We're going to say else if instance does not equal null, that means if for some reason instance already exists, and that means we'll have two different instances of our scene manager, then we're going to destroy this game object. This ensures we only have one scene manager within our scene. All right. Great. Okay, that's basically set up our singleton pattern. This is going to allow us, these lines of code are going to allow us to access different functions within our scene manager that help us load our level and position our character in the right places. So we're going to say sayonara to scene manager for a second, and we're going to go back to our warp pipe. We need to make one more script. This will be the last script we make in this tutorial. And we're going to call this warp pipe script. All right, this is going to be a really small script, but it's going to serve an important purpose. We're going to take my warp pipe script and we're going to just place it onto the parent warp pipe object. Make sure you place it on the parent object that contains our box collider trigger. So I'm going to double click on my warp pipe script so it opens up in MonoDevelop here. And why don't I zoom in a little bit so you can see the code a little bit easier. All right, so what we're going to say for this warp pipe script, first thing we're going to do is we need to be able to tell apart our different warp pipes in our scene. So we're going to do this with a public integer called warp pipe number. And we'll be able to assign different numbers to all of our warp pipes in our scene. This will help us keep track of which warp pipe we're actually going to be taking. And then I'm just going to get rid of these default functions because all I'm going to need is void on trigger stay. All right, great. I don't need another collider. I just need to be able to say when I'm inside of this collider, what are we going to do? We're going to say if input.get key down, and I'm just going to do simple keycode.c. So if I press C on the keyboard, then we're going to do some stuff. We're going to say scene manager dot instance dot load scene, and then we're going to pass in our warp pipe number. End it with a semicolon, and that's all we're going to do for warp pipe. But you'll notice I have an error right now. Load scene is in red. That's because we're going to our scene manager script over here, and we're calling up the variable name of our scene manager as we described right here. And then we're saying we're going to use the load scene function, but I don't have a load scene function. And then we're passing in which warp pipe we're actually colliding with right now. So why don't we just go ahead and make our load scene function real quickly. I'm going to go ahead and get rid of this void update. We're not going to be needing that. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to make a public void load scene function. And instead of just a closed parentheses, I'm going to come in and say int. I'm going to call this past warp pipe number. So whenever we call this function right here, we're going to say if this is warp pipe 1, we're going to pass the integer 1 into this local variable for our function here. All right, so we're inside of our load scene function. We're going to hit Control S to save our scripts, like so. All right, so what have we done so far? We've created a warp pipe. that when we enter our collider trigger and then press C on our keyboard, we call a load scene function inside of our scene manager, and then we pass in which warp pipe number this is right here. And then it gets passed into this integer variable, and then we can mess around with it right here. The only bad thing about this passed in warp pipe number is that we can only use that variable inside of this function. So what we need to do is we need to be able to pass this passed warp pipe number into a variable that we can use throughout this whole function, this whole class rather. So I'm going to say public int current pipe number. So whenever we call our function, the first thing we're going to do is say current pipe number equals passed warp pipe number. That way, we can use our current pipe number to point at whatever pipe we've passed in from our warp pipe class, and we can use this variable now in all of the functions, or throughout this whole class basically. All right, so I'm going to press Control S. I think now would be a good time to save and test if we're getting our current pipe number passed between the warp pipe we just taken. So that means we're going to have to kind of set up our scene right now. All right. So the first thing I'm going to do is bring back my wall, and I'm going to set up a test scene real quickly. All right. So there's my warp pipe, and I've already got some text made. You saw in the very first part of the video. So I'm just going to position my warp pipe in front of this warp pipe right here. And then, you know what? I'm going to go ahead and select this warp pipe and go to my prefab setting, my inspector in the top right, and hit apply. That way it'll update my warp pipe prefab down here. So whenever I pull this warp pipe into different scenes, it'll be ready to go with the correct components on it. And then I'm just going to duplicate this warp pipe, and I'm just going to place it in front of these different texts I have set up, and basically recreate that first scene that you saw me demonstrate in the first minute of the video. All right, so a little bit of scene organization. I'm going to take my first person controller and set it up right there. So we have warp pipe 1, 2, and 3. Now I'm going to go to each warp pipe and assign it an integer number in my warp pipe script. So I select my first warp pipe and give it a value of 1. I'll select my second warp pipe right here, give it an integer value of 2. Select my third warp pipe, and its value is now 3. And I'm going to File, Save Scene. So basically I have 3 different warp pipes, all with separate warp pipe numbers. So whenever I go in and use these warp pipes, I can pass this number into my load scene function. That's what's going to help us go between our different scenes and get set into the right position. All right, with this, I'm just going to save the scene one more time. And now I'm going to load my second scene right here. All right. Well, you know what? I kind of messed up that prefab earlier. So I got this text little group set up. I'm going to drag this text group and make it a prefab. This will be useful whenever I open up my second scene. I'll delete that. And then I can just take my text prefab and load it into my scene right here. And now I have my messages. I'm going to go ahead and make their text white since it's a darker cave-like scene. There we go. And now I'm going to take the same warp pipe prefab I just made and drag it into this scene and give my first warp pipe an integer value of 1 in my inspector over here. Duplicate it, and we're just going to set up the same kind of scheme going on right here. All right, great. So with warp pipe 2 selected, let me just organize, get my warp pipes in order. And I'm just updating their integer values right now in my inspector. So I have warp pipe number 1, warp pipe number 2. Right here you can see my inspector. And warp pipe number 3. All right, and I'm going to save this scene. We need to do one more thing to get this scene set up. I need to take my camera and delete it. And I need to bring in my first-person controller and my standard assets, like so. And there we go. All right, let's test it. And if it breaks, we'll find out why. If it works, we'll be happy. All right, so I'm going to save this scene. And why don't I start in first scene? So I press there. All right, nothing's happening. What's going on? Well, we haven't actually given any code that takes us between our scenes. But maybe we can go and jump on our first warp pipe. Let me select my scene manager. Notice how my current pipe number right here is 0. But yet when I press C, my scene manager's current pipe number now equals 1. And actually, you know what? I'm going to go to my wall and deactivate it so I can get at all my pipes right here. And I want you to pay attention. I'm going to select my scene manager. I want you to pay attention to the current pipe number over in my inspector. I jump on my first warp pipe, press C. My current pipe number is now 1. I jump into my second warp pipe, press C. My current pipe number is now 2. Third, my current pipe number is now 3. So we've already accomplished a lot so far. We already got our on-trigger stay and key input to load or pass our warp pipe number into our scene manager class using this line of code right here. All right, great. So why is that powerful? Well, now we'll be able to basically pick and choose which pipe we're going to load into whenever we change scenes. So why don't we just continue with our code. All right. First warp pipe. The next bit of code we need to tackle is we need to make an array of all the pipes in our scene, and we need to be able to get at our current player character. So to do this, we're going to select my pipe, and we're going to give it a new tag. We're going to go to Add Tag, and we're going to call this Warp Pipe. All right. I'm going to select my first warp pipe here, and now I'm going to reassign it to a warp pipe tag. But you'll notice none of my other warp pipes have that tag. Well, since it's a prefab, we can hit apply, and now all my warp pipes have a tag warp pipe. This will help us populate an array of all the pipes in our scene. Our array is going to be able to let us check between all the different pipes in our scene and pick and choose which one we actually want to spawn at. We also need to be able to get at our player so we can adjust his position. So I'm going to make sure that my first person controller has a player tag, he does, and my warp pipe has a warp pipe tag. This is going to be really nice. Why don't we make some new variables? Let's make a public game object called player and a public game object. And then we're going to make an array, so we do open bracket and close bracket. And we'll call this warp pipe array. We're going to hit Control and S. And then we want to populate our player game object and our warp pipe array. So there's two things we got to do this. Whenever we're awake, we want to do a few checks. We want to say if my player game object equals null, meaning if it's currently empty, then we're going to say player equals game object find object singular with tag, and then we're going to say player, the string player, and then we're going to say if warp pipe array dot length equals 0, meaning if there's nothing in my warp pipe array, then we're going to say warp pipe array equals game object dot find objects plural with tag, and then we're going to say we're going to populate it with all the warp pipe tags in our scene. So basically, when we awake, we're going to populate our two game objects we just made with the correct things using tags. All right. Now we're going to use a new function. We're going to say void on level was loaded. And this function is called every time a new scene is loaded into our game. So we need to have this function because when we load into our cave area, we're going to have a different set of pipes and we're going to have a different player object. So every time we load a scene, we got to reassign our player in our warp pipe array. So we're just basically going to do the same thing. And in fact, I can copy this code right here. And we don't need if statements right here. We're just going to simply let them be. All right, great. And why don't we go ahead and make some magic happen with my load scene down here. All right, we're going to say, well, we're going to use a new function called application.loadedLevel. So we're going to say if application.loadedLevel equals 0, that means if our current level is our first scene, well, what equals 0, what does that even mean? Well, let me go ahead and finish this brackets, then I'll show you how we can make sense of this line of code right here. Basically, we're saying if our application's loaded level equals scene 0, then we're going to do this code. But how do we know what scene 0 and scene 1 and scene 2 is? Well, I'm going to make sure I save this. Well, this is where we go to our file, build settings. All right. And we're currently in our first scene, which is our grassy scene. So in our current scene, we're just going to press add current. And you'll notice loading between scenes. This is the name of the tutorial, scenes, first scene.unity. And you'll notice this little 0 right here. That basically, this add current button basically assigned our current scene, our first scene, the number 0. All right, we're going to get rid of it. And why don't we double click and go into our second scene? And we're going to do the same thing. We're going to go to File, Build Settings, Add Current. And here you can see my second scene.unity now has the number 1. That's what this line of code points at. That 0 and 1 in our build settings right here. So that's very important that you make sure you add your scenes to your build settings. Otherwise, you won't be able to point at which level you're currently in. So basically, we're saying if we're in scene 0, which is our first grassy scene, then we're going to say application dot load level. And then here we're just going to type the actual name of the scene we want to load, which is second scene. All right, that second scene corresponds to whatever I've named my scenes over here in my scenes folder. It's a little confusing because here we're using, well, you know what? I bet we could just do this. I bet we could just say load level 1, or we could do the string that I just did. All right, and why don't we copy this line of code because it's going to set up nicely right here. But we're going to do an else if, and we're going to just swap these numeric values out. So basically we're saying if we're in scene 0, load scene 1. If we're in scene 1, load scene 0. This is basically going to allow us to swatch back and forth between our scenes. And I think this should work. Let's see what happens. Object reference not set to an instance of our object. So our warp pipe number is having a trouble picking up what number we're in. So let's see. Let's troubleshoot that. All right. All right. Why don't we try going to the first scene and trying it there? Hit play. Press C. Oh, that's weird. The error's not happening anymore. I didn't change the code, I don't think. What I did do was I think I had current pipe number equals past warp pipe number. I think I just made sure I did that in my first line of code when I did my load scene. So make sure you have your current pipe number equals past warp pipe number before you actually load your levels. I think it was a problem where it was trying to access one of our warp pipes, but we've already loaded out of that level, so we couldn't access that warp pipe anymore. So syntax and order matters in this case, I believe. All right, so as you can see, I got a few things going on right now. All right, pay attention to my warp pipe number in my inspector. Current warp pipe number is 0. All right, and if I go to second warp pipe, my current pipe number should be updated to 2. But you'll notice I'm still just starting at the same position inside of my level. We haven't added any code to make sure I, end up on top of the corresponding pipes. So why don't we go ahead and do that right now? All right. So all we're going to do in our on level was loaded function, that means every time we load into a new level, we're going to use a for loop to determine which pipe we're going to be spawning on top of. So we're going to say for int I equals 0. That's our counter integer. And then we're going to use a semicolon. And then our counter, as long as our counter is less than our warp pipe, we don't want to do that, warp pipe array dot length. And then every time we go through the loop, we're going to add 1 to it. I misspelled warp pipe array. There we go. And then we're going to add our brackets. And this is where the magic of our scene loader comes in. And it's going to get a little complicated with this line of code, but we're going to power through it. Okay. That's an uppercase length. There we go. Make sure your syntax is correct. Dot uppercase L for length. We're going to say if warp pipe array I, meaning whatever pipe in our array we're currently pointing to at I. You know what? I'm going to go ahead and comment that out. I'm going to show you how arrays have corresponding numbers attached to them. So I'm going to hit play. And I'm going to pause it. And now you can see my warp pipe array publicly displayed within my scene manager right here. And you can see I have element 0, 1, and 2. Basically, this is warp pipe bracket 0. This is warp pipe bracket 1, warp pipe bracket 2. So our warp pipes are numbered in our array. And we can get at them by saying something like warp pipe array 1. So warp pipe array 1 that we've written in our code right here would point at element 1 in our array, which would point at this warp pipe right here. And you'll notice that our warp pipes are not in order in our array. It's 2, 1, 0 instead of 0, 1, 2 as you would think. But that's not going to matter with our for loop that we're setting up. So that's important because warp pipe 1 does point at our element 1 over here. But when we go through our array, it's pretty ingenious how for loops work with arrays. Our counter variable right here is going to act in place of what number in our array we're going to be looking at. So the first time through our loop, we're going to say if warp pipe array 0, which points at element 0, we're going to be looking at that particular warp pipe in this line of code. So we're on our first time through our loop right now. We're saying if our warp pipe object and our warp pipe array, the very first one, element 0, if that warp pipe dot get component, and then we're going to access the warp pipe script that we wrote for it, and then we're going to do a parentheses dot warp pipe number equals current pipe number, and then close that parentheses there. So basically we're saying if our warp pipe in our arrays warp pipe number equals our current pipe number, then what are we going to do? Then we're going to say player.transform.position equals warp pipe array, and then our counter variable .transform.position. So basically, we're going to go through every single pipe in our pipe array using our counter variable, and we're going to get the warp pipe component, which is our warp pipe script right here. And if its number corresponds to our current pipe number, then we're going to spawn our player in that current pipe number position. Yeah, it's a little confusing. So basically, it allows that line of code allows us to go from warp pipe number 1 in our first scene to warp pipe number 1 in our second scene. This warp pipe number is the magic ticket here. It signifies that this particular warp pipe in my scene right here corresponds to the first warp pipe in this scene because they now share the same warp pipe number. And this for loop makes sure that our current pipe number that we're passing in, remember, our current pipe number that we're passing in between scenes, that number is making sure that it matches whatever warp pipe we are designating to in our scene. A little confusing, but the logic's there. It works. All right, so let's hit play, and I'll walk us through what's currently going on here. Let me go ahead and select my scene manager. All right. As you can see in my inspector to the right, my current pipe number is 0. So I'm going to jump on my first pipe, and I'm going to hit the C key. My current pipe number is now 1, and it corresponded to the pipe number in this scene. So it put me on top of my first warp pipe. So if I go to my third warp pipe, all right, I'm going to select my scene manager. As you can see, my current pipe number is 1, but yet whenever I press C on my third warp pipe, my warp pipe number changes to 3. My for loop checks and see which pipe in this current scene also has the number 3, and it updates my player's position on top of my third warp pipe. Same thing for second warp pipe. And that pretty much allows you to keep track of which position you want to enter and exit from. It's all about our pipe number integers that we're passing back and forth between our warp pipe scripts and our scene controller, or our scene manager script. All right, so that's the basic gist of this mechanic. Like I said, the magic occurs in a few different places. Our don't destroy on load line of code makes sure that our scene manager object keeps existing between our scenes, and our singleton setup that we did right here and right here allows us to make sure that our scene manager, there's only one instance of it, and we can call it globally in whatever script we choose. So we're able to say scene manager.instance.load scene, and then us assigning a warp pipe number to each warp pipe, and there's a brother and sister connection between our warp pipes and our scenes. So our first warp pipe is prescribed the number 1, and in our second scene, our first warp pipe is also given the number 1. That number is passed along with when we call our load scene. This number is passed into our load scene function right here. All right. So we update our current pipe number to whatever warped pipe, past warp pipe number we just used. So if we used pipe 2, our current pipe number in our scene manager becomes 2. And since we're not destroying it on load, our current pipe number stays 2 in our new scene. And then our for loop right here goes through all the pipes in our array until it finds the warp pipe with the correct, or until it finds the warp pipe with the correct number that corresponds to our past warp pipe number stored in current pipe number variable right here. And then we just update the position of our player according to whatever pipe we're at currently in our for loop as we're going through our array here. It's a mouthful, but the logic's all there. So hopefully when you worked along with it, it'll all just click in your head. But for all intents and purposes, this lecture is done. So I hope you guys learned a lot. And now you can, now we get the error again. But it doesn't seem to happen when we load from first scene. So why don't I go ahead and troubleshoot that real quickly. And now I see our fatal mistake on why starting in first scene works, but not second scene. You'll notice in second scene, we don't have a scene manager made. So we don't have any managers here helping us load between levels. So as you can see, when I press C, it can't reference whatever code I'm trying to call. But why does it work in scene 1? When I press play, I have my scene manager object right there, and I hop into my first warp pipe. That don't destroy on load passes that game object into our new scene. So now our second scene has our game manager. So if you really want to make sure that that kind of bug doesn't happen to you, so you may, for instance, have a different starting position for your level where you can, it's just random between which level you want to load first. Why don't we go ahead and make my scene manager a prefab. All right, so I just drag and drop scene manager into my prefabs down here. I'm going to open up second scene. Now I can take that scene manager prefab and place it within my scene here. So if I press play, I now have a scene manager and everything's working really nicely. All right, great. So that'll do it for this video. And thanks for watching.